Okay, I'm not going to read this whole question. I want to paraphrase, but here's a couple of things. If you are aware of them, what are your thoughts on Jacob L. Wright's views and findings of the Bible, and are they accurate? Goes on to say that essentially that from what he's read is that the Bible's a work of fiction with history sprinkled throughout, and that it was made from a loser's tale, quote unquote. Goes on to talk about the Exodus and how that was a make-believe story for various reasons, work of fiction. But the question ends like this. I hate that I find myself conflicted with doubts because of what I think to be a theory. I will again add that I am a Christian and truly believe in Jesus and believe that Christianity is not a man-made religion. And so because they don't know all the history and how the Bible matches up with that, they're conflicted. I think a lot of people maybe are in this position that either A, are new believers, B, haven't done their homework, and then Satan puts doubts in their head regarding all the trolls on the internet that come up with some YouTube video. So how would you approach this? And do you know Jacob L. Wright?
No, I don't know Jacob L. Wright, but who cares? This is old stuff.
Yeah.
It's all the same nonsense. Back in the 1800s, some German theologians came up with the idea of the documentary hypothesis, and that's basically that the whole Old Testament before the post-Babylonian writings is something that's fictional, and that in actuality these writings were written post-Babylon. And so the book of Deuteronomy, which the Bible teaches, which Jesus teaches, was written by Moses. These guys would say were written by priests and leaders of Israel after the Babylonian captivity. And so that's something that's prevalent in colleges. When you go to a world religions class, it's been like that since I was a kid. It's one of those things where when I was in, I took a world religions class as an elective when I was in college. And one of the first things that the teacher told me was, I said, well, Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And she said Moses couldn't have written the first 5 books of the Old Testament because there was no alphabetic writing at the time. And so I just went down to the library and did some research on that whole thing. Found out that not too long before, actually a decade before, they found all kinds of archaeological evidence of alphabetic writing in Hebrew a decade before. And so she wasn't up on the archaeology, and she didn't know what she was talking about. Ultimately, a lot of these questions, you're a believer in Jesus, and this is where you can start with this stuff. If Jesus tells you that Moses wrote the law, and he does that numerous times, if Jesus tells you that Moses wrote the law, then Moses is a real character, and the law is written in the context of the Exodus, and you can bet that those things are historical. And so that's where you can start. Jesus is the best witness to what you do with the books of the Old Testament. In fact, every single let me think. I think there was one that I couldn't find.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, but every single controversial event that takes place in the Old Testament, the creation of man and woman, and God joining them together as wife, that's Genesis chapter 2. Jesus confirms. The flood of Noah, Jesus confirms. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Jesus confirms that. And as you Jonah
yeah.
And the great fish, Jesus confirms that. And as you go through the Old Testament stories, all the ones that are the ones that always get attacked by unbelievers, Jesus confirms every single one of them. It's like he knew that people were going to come along in the last days and start picking on those things. And so if you're going to have this guy's position towards the Old Testament, then Jesus doesn't know what he's talking about, or he's lying at that point. And so, you have to make a decision there. And that is not all the evidence that we have for these things. You can go back in history and you can see evidence of all these things, except for those things that obviously happened to people personally. We do know that Sodom and Gomorrah existed. Sodom and Gomorrah are listed in cuneiform tablets as being trade partners with other nations in the Middle East. And so we know that Sodom and Gomorrah existed. We know the area that Sodom and Gomorrah existed, and we know that Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed. In fact, they think that they found Sodom and Gomorrah. And that's debatable, but people debate on which areas Sodom and Gomorrah was in, but there's some good evidence that they found Sodom and Gomorrah. And so it happened just as it's stated in the Bible. You go through and you look at the archaeological evidence, and there it is. And so it's like this with all kinds of issues. There are people who are named in the Old Testament, for example, in the books of Jeremiah and the book of Isaiah, named. And we've found their names on these they're implements that are used basically to sign documents. And so their names are on these things. And so, it's like a stamp type of thing. and so we found these. We found evidence of David within 150 years of David's life. He's listed on what are called stela. And so when you're going through and you're looking at the Old Testament, for a long time, people did not believe in Solomon. People did not believe in David. People, some of the kings of Israel, they didn't believe in these guys. And they basically what they did was if you have the Old Testament on a timeline, they took everything before Babylon and they made it non-history. And what's been happening, and part of the reason for that is because we had evidence of what was happening with Israel post-Babylon. And so Israel's evidence in archaeology came from after the Babylonian captivity, and there wasn't a lot of evidence before that point. Well, the more evidence they get, the further back the history of Israel is going. And every time every time they turn a shovel over in the nation of Israel, they're finding evidence for the reliability of the Old Testament. And so it's a nonsense. It's not a good position to come out against the Bible, especially when you're talking about the historical record, because every single time that there is an argument between the Bible and actual archaeology, and actual archaeology is where you are actually digging up evidence. The lack of evidence is not evidence of the lack of a story. The lack of evidence is a lack of evidence. And so the fact that you don't have specifically any original transcript writings by Moses does not mean that Moses did not exist. Does not mean that Moses did not write the Old Testament. The fact that you don't have any archaeological evidence for Moses at this point does not mean that Moses didn't exist. It means we don't have any archaeological evidence of that at this point. And that fact doesn't negate the idea that we will gain some archaeological evidence at some point in the future. And so you have this with all kinds of things that you have in the Bible. And so people who've come out against the Old Testament have been proved wrong, and wrong over and over and over. For example, one of my favorite examples is there was no evidence for Hittites, and so the Hittite kingdom is something that you see throughout the Old Testament, and so it was something that supposed scholars, biblical scholars, these are guys who say that they know the Bible and they know the scholarship behind the Bible, and they are not Christians necessarily. And so biblical scholars poo-pooed the idea of the Hittites, said it didn't exist. It was proof that the Bible was unhistorical until we found evidence of the Hittites. And then you find that they had an empire that spanned the whole Middle East, And again, before that point, there was a lack of evidence for the Hittites. And, after they dug them up, it's all over the place. And so all the guys who said the Hittites didn't exist and the Bible is wrong look like idiots after the fact. And it's probably, this guy has probably made statements, from what he's saying. He's probably already made statements that show them to be naive concerning the evidence. There are good books on archaeology. A couple of authors, Hoffmeyer is a great author, Kitchen is another great author, and they're both archaeologists. And so they go through and Hoffmeyer, both Hoffmeyer and Kitchen give evidence for the Exodus. And so one of the problems with the Exodus is actually a couple of the problems. Egypt is not going to talk about getting their tails whipped by a bunch of slaves. That is not what goes on Stela. That is not what's recorded in their history. They're never going to say that. We do have archaeological evidence of the existence of Israel early that is Egyptian, and so we've got that. And again, if you get these books by Hoffmeyer and Kitchen, you can check that stuff out. So number one, you're never going to get evidence that the Egyptians got wiped out by the Israelis that's written down by the Egyptians as a statement of historical fact. You're not going to get that. The other thing that you have a problem with when you're looking for evidence of the Exodus is you got a bunch of people in tents. They're not building cities as they're wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. And so you're not going to be able to go to Sinai necessarily and find a bunch of evidence for the existence of the Exodus and the Israelis and the encampments and that kind of stuff. You can go through and you can pace out where these encampments likely were. And so there's the fact that the geography matches what the book of Exodus and the book of Numbers talks about is evidence. But again, when you're talking about the Exodus, the evidence is not going to be like the evidence of Megiddo being an Israeli city, for example, or Samaria being an Israeli city. These are places where there's stones in the ground, and so it's going to be slightly different. It's a little bit more ephemeral at that point. So.
Did you see the patterns of Exodus? Or
yeah, I've seen that.
What are your thoughts on that? And I don't mean to make this a huge long thing, but
I think that there are still patterns of evidences based on a couple of things. One of them is that there's some problems with Egyptian chronology, and Egyptian chronology comes from a priest named Merneptah, basically, and we get it from Greek historians. And Merneptah, it looks like he took some kingships and placed them chronologically after each other, when some of them were probably co-regents. Northern kingdom of Egypt versus it's called the upper and the lower kingdoms, and so the lower kingdom being the northern and the upper being the southern kingdom of Egypt, and so you can have two pharaohs having reigns at the same time, and so there's probably some overlap there. Most of it is about the idea that a lot of scholars mistakenly make that because the treasure cities are called Ramesses, that they have to have been built by Ramses.
Right.
And that's not necessarily so. Ramses can take his name. The names, it comes from Ra. And so Ra is one of the gods of Egypt, and that name and variations of that name were around for quite a while. And so basically what a lot of scholars do is they take the Exodus as being during the time of Ramses and his father Seti, and that puts it a couple of hundred years later than where the Bible puts it. So the Bible puts the Exodus right around 1446 BC. And what the Ramses theory, where it puts it, is about 200 years later. And so if you take and you shift some of the evidence that you've got in the Bible, what scholars try to do is they try to take the it's called the 13 the 13th century BC Exodus, and they try to match that to Egyptian and Israeli history. And there's problems with that because you've got a 200-year difference.
Yeah.
And if you take that and you put it back to the 1446 date, then it works out just right well,
Yeah.
all the way through. And so, and I believe that that's true. And
So in layman's terms, when is the start date based off of the pharaohs, and the dating method is different in Egyptian thought versus Jewish thought?
it's not even Egyptian thought. It's Egyptologist interpretation of
Right.
specifically the issue of the treasure cities and Ramses himself. That's where the problem
Yeah.
comes in.
And
So they're assuming that
yeah.
that dates
And
it.
the guy that started that, everyone just kind of took that as gospel.
Uh-huh.
And so the whole history has been from that point. But
Right. Yeah.
if that point's wrong,
Yep.
then that fixes it.
Right. That fixes it. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So what I was going to say on this question is I was a skeptic. And I remember I first got into Christianity. God showed me some cool things. I became a believer. And then I got to that first Bible contradiction. And I'm like, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But if you go through this, I mean, been talking here for 10 minutes or so, you know, Haley's Bible Handbook. I have a whole library full of stuff.
Yeah.
What I was looking for is some things I could sink my teeth into to believe. And what I ended with was such a mountain of evidence that I realized I didn't know who I was dealing with. And the evidence is so overwhelming that it's not that it converted me. It's that the truth is on this side so much more so that I look like a fool being on the other side where some of these, you know, internet commando and YouTubers are.
Yeah.
And so when you go dive into that, it's like that is such an encouragement to your faith. But I love how, you know, the point I am at now, and I like how Missler says it, which is how you described it, was if you want to save yourself hours of boring library research when it comes to the documentary hypothesis, just go and read what Jesus said.
Yeah.
And then it's over.
Yeah. And, you know, the basics of the documentary hypothesis of, you know, those things have been abandoned by real biblical scholars.
Yeah.
You get guys who know their stuff.
Yeah.
Because it just doesn't work, you know, and I'm not going to go, it's really boring,
Yeah.
but I'm not going to go into all the details of that, but it's arbitrary. Basically what they're doing is they're saying, you know, when you're talking about Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, it was two different creation stories written by two different people. And at different times, and one is a Elohist and the other one is a Jehovahist, and again, it's already getting boring, right? And so, but one of the problems with that is the things that they think identify a certain section are things that you see in sections that shouldn't be identified as that, and it just all falls apart. And so it was torn apart as soon as it came out, but it's one of those things that non-believers latched onto to try to minimize the impact of the Bible in their lives. And
Totally.
that's the way that always goes. Here's another one with this. There's an issue with Jericho. And when you read in the Bible, the walls of the city of Jericho was burnt. There was no long siege. It was 7 days, and the city of Jericho was taken and burnt to the ground. The walls fell out, and what else can we say? It looks like there was an earthquake. When you're looking at the biblical text, God used something to make the walls fall out. In any case, when you go to the city of Jericho, Garstang, he was an archaeologist, found exactly that. That the walls fell out, that the city was burnt. There were basically these jars, clay jars, fired clay jars that were full of grain, and they were burnt. And that lets you know that there was no long siege because they had plenty of food. And so all the aspects of the story of Jericho were fulfilled. Garstang, believed that was a fulfillment. That was evidence that the story of Joshua and Jericho were, in actuality, the truth. And so then another archaeologist who was actually a student of Garstang took over the dig at Jericho and had it carbon dated. And she found that the city of Jericho was destroyed about 150 years before the biblical dates for Jericho. And so she said that Jericho couldn't have fallen to the Israelis because nobody lived there at the time, despite the evidence that everything that the Bible talks about actually happened there. Some other archaeologists have gone back and looked at some of the evidence, and one of the things that she didn't do was identify certain types of pottery, and he goes back and identifies a certain types of pottery, and there's some other things with some amulets, that kind of stuff, that actually dates it to the time that the Bible puts the dating of Jericho, which would let you know that the carbon-14 date is inaccurate. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the problems that you have in archaeology have to do with what your assumptions are. And if you're assuming that carbon-14 dating is accurate for the dating of Jericho, then you're going to have a problem there. But when you look at at what's there on the ground, and what we know for sure is evidence of the timeline, including these amulets that are buried in graves and that kind of stuff in that area, and some of the pottery that's used there, and whether or not it would be in that area, and that kind of thing. They use this stuff to try to get an about date for cities in the Middle East. When you start looking at those things, they all date them at the time of Joshua, the biblical time of Joshua. And so, there are arguments over this stuff. And so if you don't know about the argument, then it looks like the Bible's been refuted until you get a biblical archaeologist and he goes, well, no, it's not. And in fact, here's the reality here.
Yeah.
And so, you have to keep that in mind. Archaeology is not an exact science, and dating in archaeology is not exact, unless you have you have areas that you can go from. So it's 15 years after the Battle of Carchemish, or something along those lines. That's put on a stela, that kind of thing. Then you can start getting some accurate dates, but otherwise, these are about times.
Sure.
Yeah, you have to keep that in mind.